Welcome back to my channel, and in today's video we are going to continue our discussion on the temporomandibular joint. This is series 2 of the temporomandibular joint series, and here we discuss the joint capsules of the temporomandibular joint, the ligaments of the temporomandibular joint, and finally the most important muscles of the temporomandibular joint, or the muscles of mastication. And if you wish to know anything in particular, the time codes are given below in the comment box and the description. You can just check on to that. Here we discuss on to the joint capsule, ligaments and muscles of the temporomandibular joint in the most simplified and elaborate manner. Yes, and first we are going to discuss about the capsule of the temporomandibular joint. The joint capsule of the temporomandibular joint. As like any other synovial joint, the temporomandibular joint has a joint capsule, right? What are the peculiarities of the temporomandibular joint capsule? First, let us see from where to where this joint capsule is extending. You have here the temporal bone. This region is known as the mandibular fossa, and of course you have here the mandibular condyle. Yes, and here you have the coronoid process, which is not much important for us at now. Okay, now let us see where exactly is the temporomandibular joint capsule is attached. The temporomandibular joint capsule covers the mandibular fossa, It reaches up to the articular eminence, this one. It covers the articular eminence, and finally to the neck of the temporomandibular joint. See, this is the arrangement, or this is the orientation of the temporomandibular joint capsule, that is from the mandibular fossa, the articular eminence, and finally to the neck of the temporomandibular joint, condyle or condyloid process of the mandible. That is the orientation. And now we have a specialized structure in the temporomandibular joint which serves a very crucial function in the temporomandibular joint. Can you guess which that structure is? That is the articular disc. Yes, the articular disc in the temporomandibular joint divides the temporomandibular joint capsule into two layers. The articular disc, actually it is not dividing outside, this is happening in the inside. Okay, if the joint capsule is covering like this, here you have the disc and it divides into an upper compartment and a lower compartment. The superior portion is lax. The superior portion is lax, whereas inferior portion is taut. The inferior portion is taut. Can you guess why is it oriented, or why is it superior portion lax and inferior taut? That is because, yes, come on, that is because the motion in the temporomandibular joint should happen in the superior region. Here the motion should occur, and to motion to occur, the capsule should not be much tight, because the temporomandibular joint is a relatively mobile joint. It has different degrees of freedom, and mobility is very essential in the temporomandibular joint. So the capsule is free at the lax at the superior portion where the movement has to take place, whereas at the inferior portion the capsule should be very toughly, very rigidly attached to the temporomandibular joint, that is to the mandible, because you know that there are no much bony connections. Okay, and this temporomandibular joint capsule has to provide the sufficient stability. Yes, sufficient stability or sufficient holding power, and that is why the inferior part is tough or taut. So the temporomandibular joint capsule, you studied about its orientation. The superior region is lax, the inferior is tight or taut. Very good. And the temporomandibular joint has an anterior portion, it has a medial portion, it has a lateral portion, and it has finally a posterior portion. How many portions? It has a superior, anterior, medial, lateral and posterior aspects or posterior portions for the joint capsule. Why is it important? I'll give you that. Yes, the anterior, middle and the posterior are loose ones. The anterior, middle and posterior portion of the temporomandibular joint disc capsule is weak one, whereas its lateral band or lateral portion is very strong and is very important in preventing the lateral displacements and so on. So the lateral aspect of the temporomandibular joint capsule is very strong and it is reinforced by some ligaments, which you will see later, right? Yes, let us once again revise the capsule. It is having an anterior portion, it is having a medial and it is having a posterior portion, and of course a lateral portion, which is very important. Anterior, medial and posterior is relatively having less function. Anterior, medial and posterior is having relatively less function, whereas the lateral portion is having a very crucial function, that is to provide lateral stability, as well as it is reinforced by the ligaments, right? And the last thing that you want to note about the temporomandibular joint is the joint capsule is highly innervated and richly vascularized, which means that the joint capsule has a very crucial role in the proprioceptive and sensory function. That is, the temporomandibular joint capsule is highly innervated, which makes it a very important structure, which has a very crucial role in the sensory and proprioceptive function. Of course, even if you close your eyes, you can say that if my jaw is going posterior, anterior translation or protrusion or depression or lateral translation, all these are possible because of various sensory and proprioceptive feedback over there, and this capsule has a specific role in it. That's all about our temporomandibular joint capsule. I think that's an easy discussion. Let us summarize. The temporomandibular joint capsule is lax superiorly and tight inferiorly. It covers the mandibular fossa, articular eminence and the neck of the mandibular condyle, right? And it is having a superior lax and inferior taut, because superior has to permit the movement, inferior has to hold that one, right? Very good. And of course it has an anterior, medial and lateral portion and a posterior portion. The lateral portion is very stiff. The capsule is richly innervated by various nerves and vascularized, which means that it has a very abundant or a very crucial role in proprioceptive and sensory feedback. And now we move on to the second one, that is the ligaments in the temporomandibular joint. The ligaments in the temporomandibular joint. Do you know what are the ligaments in the temporomandibular joint? Any guess? Yes, the ligaments in the temporomandibular joint are 3 in number, which are, the first one, temporomandibular joint. So, temporomandibular ligament. Very good, right? Yes. Then you have a styloid process over here that connects to the mandible. That is a stylomandibular ligament. Stylomandibular ligament. And finally, you have a sphenoid bone which is connected, and a sphenomandibular ligament. Which are that ligament? Temporomandibular ligament, stylomandibular ligament, and sphenomandibular ligament. We have 3 ligaments in the temporomandibular joint, which are the temporomandibular, stylomandibular and spheno. Styloid process, remember it as stylomandibular. Sphenoid bone, remember it as sphenomandibular. And of course temporomandibular, you can remember it. And everywhere you have the mandible. So this is relatively easy to remember, right? TSS. Okay. Yes, the temporomandibular ligament, it is a strong ligament. It is a strong ligament. Clear? This stylomandibular ligament is a weak ligament and one of the most weakest ligament in the temporomandibular joint. And the sphenomandibular ligament is a relatively strong ligament. It's relatively strong ligament. It's relatively strong ligament, right? The second point about the temporomandibular joint ligament, it is made up of an outer oblique part. It is made up of an outer oblique part and inner, if it is oblique, what will be the opposite? And inner horizontal part, whereas the stylomandibular ligament, we don't have much specific study onto it, but it says that stylomandibular ligament is actually thickening of the parotid sheath. You have the parotid gland, parotid sheath over here, and the thickening of the parotid sheath is sometimes referred to as the stylomandibular ligament. And the sphenomandibular ligament, it acts as a hinge, okay? It acts as a hinge on which mandible is suspended, Clear? On which mandible is suspended. We'll see that very clearly in the later discussion. Yes, so we have three ligaments, that is the temporomandibular ligament, strong and made up of an outer oblique and an inner horizontal regions. A stylomandibular ligament, which is weak and which has a major function as a thickening of the parotid sheath. And finally, sphenomandibular ligament, which is relatively strong and acts as a hinge on which the mandible is suspended. Right? Now let us move on to the temporomandibular ligament in detail. It's a very simple discussion. I have made it very simplified for you. That is the temporomandibular joint ligaments. The temporomandibular ligament is the first ligament. Yes, and let us see the features. We saw that it is made up of an outer oblique part, right, and an inner horizontal part. Outer oblique part and an inner horizontal part. Let us see what are the specification of both of this. Okay, outer oblique part. Okay, outer oblique part, it arises from the articular eminence, or it is attached to the articular eminence, or it attaches the articular eminence to the neck of mandible. So this is its orientation. Now you see that this is mandibular fossa and this is articular eminence, and here you have the mandibular condyle, and this ligament is actually attached from articular eminence to the neck of the mandible, an oblique orientation, right? An oblique orientation. That is why this ligament is known as outer oblique ligament, which is a part of the temporomandibular joint ligament. Now, you see what is the function of this ligament. Can you tell what are the functions of this ligament? The function served by this outer oblique band. You know that this is the orientation of that ligament. This is the orientation of that ligament. So it acts as a suspensory ligament on which the mandibular condyle are attached. So the first role is this ligament acts as a suspensory ligament. It acts as a suspensory ligament. The second one, it prevents downward motion. It prevents downward motion or depression. It prevents or checks the depression. And third motion, it prevents or checks posterior motion. You see that the ligament has this specific orientation, and of course you can see that it will act as a suspensory ligament on which the mandibular condyles are attached. And now if this mandible is moving posteriorly, this will act as a check. Now it's fine, but when it reaches here, this one will get tight and it will check the posterior translation. At the same time, it will also prevent a further downward movement or the depression. So that are the functions of outer oblique band. And the second band is the inner horizontal band. That means here this is a horizontally oriented one. What are the orientation? This arises from the articular eminence, or it is attached to the articular eminence, right? It is attached to the articular eminence to the lateral pole of the mandible. You know that the mandible has a medial pole and a lateral pole. This is the lateral pole. It attaches to the lateral pole of the mandible and posterior part of the disc. What is that? It attaches to the lateral pole of the mandible, posterior part of the disc and articular eminence. And now you can imagine, since it is having this posterior orientation or a horizontal orientation, definitely what will be its role? Its role will be the same, prevents posterior translation or posterior movements, right? Very good. And now finally, since it is attached to the disc, we saw in our earlier discussion, the disc has a very crucial role in movement, the anterior movement, translatory movement. So this one will prevent or check or hold together the retrodiscal pad. It will check onto the retrodiscal pad so that it don't reaches up to the articular eminence and just get compressed over it. So it prevents or holds the retrodiscal pad. Right? Yes. And let us summarize about the temporomandibular joint ligament. Temporomandibular ligament, which has an outer oblique part attached to the articular eminence to the neck of the mandible, and an inner horizontal band which is attached from the articular eminence to the lateral pole of the mandible and the posterior portion of the disc. This one acts as a suspensory ligament. It prevents further downward movement and also posterior translatory movements. This one will have its attachment to the disc and thus prevents or hold together the retrodiscal pad so that it don't get compressed or impinged between the articular eminence and the condyle of the mandible. At the same time, it also prevents a posterior translation of the mandible. That's all about the temporomandibular ligament, and now we have the stylomandibular ligament, which we have already discussed. The stylomandibular ligament will be attached from, will start from the styloid process over here, and you have the mandible over here, right? It will be attached from the styloid process. It is attached to the styloid process to the angle of the mandible or the ramus of the mandible. This will have an orientation like this. This will have an orientation like this, right? Yes, and it is a weak ligament, and you have a parotid sheath over here, so we considered it as a thickening of the parotid sheath. Can you predict, if this is its orientation, what will be its function? Any idea? This one prevents the further protrusion of the mandible. Excessive protrusion of the mandible is being prevented by this ligament. You know that this is having its arrangement like this. When there is an excessive protrusion, what happens? This ligament gets tight. But of course, as I told you, this ligament is weak. Therefore, there are studies which contradict that this ligament has no particular function. And the last ligament is the sphenomandibular ligament, which is arising from the sphenoid bone over here. Like my finger, it is attached, the sphenomandibular ligament. And of course, you know that this is a hinge on which the mandible is suspended, like the temporomandibular ligament's oblique band. So it acts as a hinge on which mandible is suspended. What can be its function? It prevents excessive anterior translation. Excessive anterior translation will be prevented by this ligament. You will see and you will understand what is anterior translation, etc. when we discuss about the unique discussion on the temporomandibular joint range of motions and different motions, which is the upcoming video. And now we straight away move on to the muscles of the temporomandibular joint. The muscles of the temporomandibular joint or the muscles of mastication are very important, and they are divided into two groups. There are the primary muscles and secondary muscles. The primary muscles and secondary muscles. Do you know which are the primary muscles? Can you guess? The primary muscles are the temporalis muscle, very good. The masseter muscle, the lateral pterygoid muscle, and medial pterygoid muscle. So these are the four muscles which are making up the primary components of the muscles of mastication. And secondary ones are the suprahyoid, which has about 4 or 5 muscles, which we'll see later, and infrahyoid muscle. Suprahyoid and infrahyoid. These are two groups of muscle, and each one of them is made up of different muscles, which we will see later. Now first let us focus on the primary muscle, the temporalis muscle. What do you mean by temporalis muscle? Anybody can guess it. The temporal bone. It is related to the temporal bone, and you have the temporal bone. See, we have a concavity over the temporal bone. This concavity is being covered by this muscle as my hand. It is seen like in my hand. So it will cover the concavity. So where it is attached to the cranium. And we studied in mandible, we have a unique process, coronoid process, on which the temporalis muscle is attached. So the temporalis muscle, it runs from the temporal fossa over here, and through this it get attached to the coronoid process of the mandible. It get attached to the coronoid process of the mandible like this. And this muscle is a very large muscle. It is a fan shaped or a flat muscle, and you can readily palpate it. And do you want to palpate? Just place your hand over here and raise your forehead, or just clench your jaw like this. You can feel that this is just expanding this temporalis muscle. So the temporalis muscle is a very large muscle, a fan-shaped muscle, which is attached from the cranium and into the coronoid process of the mandible, and sometimes into the ramus of the mandible, so which is not much important, right? Yes. And the function of this muscle we will see at later, so that we have a complete discussion on that. The next one is the masseter muscle, which is a very strong muscle of mastication. The masseter muscle. Which is that muscle? The masseter muscle. So this one, where is it going to be attached? This one will be attached from the zygomatic bone. This bone over here is the zygomatic bone, not the maxilla, but the zygomatic bone. This one, the prominent one over here, and it will be attached to the ramus of the mandible. See, like my fingers, it will be attached to the ramus of the mandible, sometimes like an oblique orientation. Yes, that is your which muscle? The masseter muscle. And of course, you can palpate it if you make a fist like this. If you make some expression with your face, you can palpate it in the angle of the mandible. This angle of the mandible, you can palpate your masseter muscle. Sometimes in some person, you can see this prominently raising up when they get angry, and so yeah, yes, that is the masseter muscle, which is very crucial with regard to your mastication. Okay, and that is arising from the zygomatic bone into the ramus of the mandible. Zygomatic bone into the ramus of the mandible like this. All right, yes. And now it's time we move on to the pterygoid muscle. The lateral pterygoid and medial pterygoid. I want to tell you that both of the muscle is having a unique feature, that they have a superior portion and an inferior portion. That is, they have a superior portion and an inferior portion. Both this muscle, the lateral pterygoid and medial pterygoid, has a superior and inferior portion. Where do you see this pterygoid muscle? You don't see this outside, externally you don't see it, but this is seen interiorly. This is seen interior or medial to the mandible. Alright, now let us first focus on the lateral pterygoid. The lateral pterygoid muscle is made up of what? Two bands, that is the superior and inferior band. Lateral pterygoid muscle is made up of superior and inferior band, and one of the unique feature of this lateral pterygoid muscle is the fibers are oriented horizontally. The fibers are oriented horizontally. We had the temporomandibular joint ligament, temporomandibular joint ligament or temporomandibular ligament, where we had an oblique orientation and a horizontal orientation. Inner fibers were horizontally oriented. Similar to that, the lateral pterygoid muscle are the superior and inferior fibers are which orientation, having which orientation? The horizontal orientation itself, right? Now, do you know where is it attached? This muscle is arising and having a posterior and a horizontal orientation. I told you about the horizontal orientation. It is having posterior and horizontal orientation, and it is attached to the neck, the disc, and the articular eminence. They join together, the two bands, the superior and inferior, finally joins together like this, and they get inserted into the angle of, not to the angle of the mandible, but to the neck, the disc, and the articular eminence of the mandible. And finally, we have the last muscle, that is the medial pterygoid muscle. One of the unique feature is the line of action of these two muscles are same. So this is seen outer, this is seen inside, that is the medial pterygoid muscle. Same orientation. It arises from the sphenoid bone, pterygoid plate of the sphenoid bone, or just remember sphenoid bone, and is inserted into the ramus of the mandible near its ankle. I'll show you. Yes. So we have here outer from the zygomatic bone, we have here like this your which muscle? Your masseter muscle. So similarly interior you have from the sphenoid bone in the same orientation, same line of pull, you have your which muscle? That is a medial pterygoid, superior and inferior portion, no doubt in that two portions, and they insert into the ramus of the mandible. Here ramus of the mandible near the ankle, or just remember the ramus of the mandible. And now it's time to focus on to the unique function of all four of these muscles. And there we move on to the function of our muscles of the temporomandibular joint. Of course, what are the muscles? The temporalis muscle, okay, the temporalis muscle, the masseter muscle, the lateral pterygoid muscle and medial pterygoid muscle. Let us see what are the functions of this muscle very briefly. That is a temporalis muscle and the masseter muscle. You know that this is the orientation of the masseter and this is the orientation of the temporalis muscle. So both of them has a role in elevation of the mandible. Elevation of the mandible. Both of them has a role in the elevation of the mandible. But you know that the temporalis is from here to here and this one is from here to here. So the temporalis muscle pull can produce retrusion of the mandible. That can produce a retrusion of the mandible. Whereas the masseter, which is an opposite orientation or seen anteriorly to that, can produce protrusion of the mandible. So the masseter can produce protrusion. Retrusion is produced by the temporalis muscle alone. Now we have an easy method, that is a masseter and the medial pterygoid are having same line of the pull. So the function of the medial pterygoid is same, elevation and protrusion of the mandible. And of course you have the lateral pterygoid muscle, only one muscle which is having a depressive role. It is happening in the depression of the mandible. May I summarize the function of the muscle, which is very simple. The temporalis muscle, elevation of the mandible and the retrusion. The masseter muscle, elevation and protrusion. The medial pterygoid, same function as the masseter, elevation and protrusion. And lateral pterygoid, finally, the depression of the mandible. This is a very brief discussion on the action of the muscle. We have a very advanced and wide discussion, and there's a wide scope of discussion, which we don't do it now. If you wish, you can just refer on to that. And now we move on to the secondary muscles of mastication. If you want to have a detailed discussion on it, just let me know in the comment section. So we will have it in the future, right? The secondary muscles. The secondary muscles. The secondary muscles of mastication are two groups actually. This is the suprahyoid group and infrahyoid group. Do you remember in the initial session of this class, I told about different bones related to the temporomandibular joint. There I told about the hyoid bone, which is located over here. So the muscles which are located above the hyoid bone are known as suprahyoid group, and the muscles which are located below the hyoid bone are known as the infrahyoid group. Okay, suprahyoid group, DJMS. That is the digastric muscle, GENIOHYIOD muscle, MYLOHYOID muscle and STYLOHYOID muscle. Don't worry, this is very simple because everywhere you have the hyoid and you just remember this abbreviation and you can just add on D for digastric muscle, G for GENIOHYIOD muscle, M for MYLOHYOID muscle and S for STYLOHYOID muscle. Right? Yes, very good. And the infrahyoid group, you have here O for OMOHYIOD muscle, then STERNOHYIOD muscle, then STERNOTHYROID muscle, something different, STERNOTHYROID muscle, and finally THYROHYOID muscle. So these are the other infrahyoid muscles, which are omohyoid, S for sternohyoid, S again for sternothyroid, not hyoid, and T for thyrohyoid. We don't have to discuss much on this because they are only having accessory role in the temporomandibular joint. If we are discussing the anatomy of mastication, we have to discuss on that. But since this is fairly focused on temporomandibular joint, we just want to know what are their role in the temporomandibular. Do they have some role in the temporomandibular joint? Yes. This muscles is situated superiorly and can help in the depression of the mandible. If the role of these muscles is depression of the mandible, what will be the role of infrahyoid group? The role of infrahyoid group is actually stabilization of the hyoid bone. This has to stabilize the hyoid bone, because you know, here you have the suprahyoid group, here you have the infrahyoid group. If your hyoid bone is not stabilized, the suprahyoid muscles even cannot do its function very efficiently. So the stabilization of the hyoid bone is the most important function of your infrahyoid muscle. So you have two sets of muscles, that is a suprahyoid and infrahyoid, which you have four sets of muscles in each of them. These are all helping in the depression and they are helping in the stabilization. And in that, digastric muscle is which important because they have a fiber arising from the mastoid process and from the inferior of the mandible, two direction, and they join at the hyoid bone. This joining point is like a hyoid bone, a fibrous loop at the hyoid bone. So they have a very crucial role in the hyoid bone. In fact, this has a very crucial role in the stabilization and depression of the hyoid bone, right? If you don't want to remember it, just forget, just remember, you just have this much group of muscles in the temporomandibular joint. That's all about the discussion on this capsules, ligaments and muscles of the temporomandibular joint. And in the upcoming video, we have the unique discussion on the much awaited function in the temporomandibular joint. And if you have enjoyed this video, don't forget to click the like button and kindly subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to share with your friends so that you can share the knowledge and spread the knowledge to each and every one of them.